The room went dead silent. Not the kind of quiet you get when someone stops talking. This was the silence of men holding their breath, waiting to see blood spill across marble floors. Because when a mob boss throws a drink in Bumpy Johnson's face in front of 20 witnesses, someone was about to die. The only question was who. But Bumpy didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even wipe the whiskey dripping down his chin. He just sat there, calm as still water before a storm, and smiled. That's when every man in that room knew they were watching something legendary unfold. Because the most dangerous response to disrespect isn't rage, it's patience. And Bumpy Johnson was about to teach Vincent, the shark, Torino, the most expensive lesson of his very short remaining life. This is the story of how a single moment of arrogance destroyed a man without a single punch being thrown. How strategic thinking defeated brute force. How one calm response became the most feared reaction in the history of organized crime. The shark who forgot he was swimming in someone else's waters to understand what happened that winter night in 1955. You need to understand what Vincent Torino represented everything wrong with the new generation of mobsters flooding into New York. Where the old school operators like Bumpy Johnson had learned patience in places like Alcatraz, Torino had learned entitlement on the streets of Little Italy. Where Bumpy understood that respect was earned through intelligence and results, Torino believed it came automatically with Italian blood and family connections. By the time he set his sights on Harlem, Torino had already made a career out of underestimating his opponents. He'd muscle his way into 3 different territories, not through superior strategy, but through superior violence and the protection of his family name. Bumpy Johnson, at 48, had built something entirely different. His empire wasn't held together by fear, it was sustained by respect. When his collectors walked the streets, they weren't just taking money, they were solving problems, settling disputes, keeping the peace. When young men looked up to Bumpy, it wasn't because they were afraid of him. It was because he represented what they could become if they were smart enough, patient enough, disciplined enough. But Torino saw all of that as weakness. In his world, respect that wasn't based on fear was just delayed disrespect, and he was about to learn just how catastrophically wrong that philosophy could be. The setup 3 months of perfect patience. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning when Marcus, the book, Williams, Bumpy's most trusted collector, turned up beaten half to death in an alley off 125th Street. The message was clear: Torino wasn't just moving product anymore. He was moving to take over. Most men would have responded with bullets. Bumpy Johnson was not most men. Instead, he did something that confused everyone who knew him. He requested a meeting, a sit-down, in neutral territory, the back room of Rao's restaurant in East Harlem, where Italian and black crime families had been settling disputes for decades. But here's what nobody understood yet, including Torino himself: Bumpy hadn't requested that meeting to negotiate. He hadn't even come to fight. He'd come to document. Because for 3 months, every move Torino made, every collection he muscled, every cop he thought he'd bought, all of it had been reported back to Bumpy Johnson. The genius of Bumpy's strategy wasn't just gathering information. It was letting Torino believe he was winning while actually giving him exactly enough rope to hang himself. Every Tuesday, Torino would brag about the corners he'd taken. Bumpy made sure those conversations were overheard by the right people. Every Thursday, Torino would collect protection money from businesses that had been paying Bumpy for years. Bumpy made sure those collections were photographed. Every weekend, Torino would meet with corrupt cops to arrange for them to look the other way during his operations. Bumpy made sure those meetings were documented with military precision. By the time that February night arrived, Bumpy Johnson didn't just know everything Vincent Torino had done, he could prove it. The night everything changed, 20 men gathered in that restaurant back room. 10 of Torino's soldiers, their hands never far from their guns. 8 of Bumpy's most loyal operators, calm as church deacons despite being outnumbered. And 2 neutral witnesses from the old Italian families, there to make sure whatever happened stayed within the bounds of business. Torino arrived like he owned the place. Gold rings flashing, expensive suit pressed to perfection, surrounded by muscle that looked like they bench-pressed Cadillacs for fun. He took the head chair without being invited, poured himself wine without asking permission, and started talking before Bumpy even sat down. "Johnson," he said, not even using the respect of Mr. "You're getting old soft. Maybe it's time to step back. Let younger men handle the real business in Harlem." The insult hung in the air like smoke. In that world, in front of those witnesses, Calling a man soft wasn't just disrespect. It was a declaration of war disguised as conversation. But Bumpy just nodded slowly, like he was considering the wisdom of a schoolteacher. That's an interesting perspective, Vincent. Tell me more about this real business you're handling. And that's when Torino made his first mistake. He started bragging about the corners he'd taken, the collections he'd muscled, the police he'd bought, the fear he'd spread. Each word digging his grave deeper, because Bumpy Johnson was listening to every detail with the focused attention of a man building a case. Then Torino made his second mistake. He reached across that table, grabbed the bottle of Bumpy's whiskey that had been poured as a gesture of respect, and took a long, deliberate drink straight from the bottle. Again, the disrespect was intentional, calculated, designed to provoke. Bumpy still didn't react. That's when Torino decided to escalate to the point of no return. He stood up, looked down at Bumpy with all the arrogance of a man who'd never learned the difference between fear and respect, and said the words that would haunt him for the rest of his very brief life. Matter of fact, old man, I think you've forgotten who you're talking to. And then he threw the rest of that whiskey directly in Bumpy Johnson's face. The moment that froze time, 20 men stopped breathing. Because everyone in that room knew what came next. In their world, that level of disrespect had only one answer: blood. Usually lots of it. Usually starting immediately. But as that whiskey dripped down his face, as Torino stood there grinning like he'd just won the lottery, as his soldiers tensed for the violence they were certain was about to explode across that room, Bumpy Johnson did the last thing anyone expected. He smiled back. Not a fake smile, not a threatening smile, a genuine, almost grateful expression, like Torino had just given him an unexpected gift. And then he spoke, his voice so calm it was almost conversational. "Vincent, I want to thank you for that. Because now everyone in this room knows exactly who you are." The confusion that followed was almost as thick as the tension. Because what kind of man thanks someone for humiliating him in public? What kind of street legend sits still for that level of disrespect? But there was something in Bumpy's eyes that made the smartest men in that room realize they were missing something crucial. Something that would only become clear when the full genius of Bumpy Johnson's patience finally revealed itself. The revelation when the hunter becomes the hunted. Slowly, methodically, Bumpy reached into his jacket pocket. A movement that made every gun in the room shift slightly, and pulled out a white handkerchief. He wiped the whiskey from his face with the deliberation of a man who had all the time in the world. Then he folded the handkerchief carefully and placed it on the table in front of him. "Vincent," he said, his voice still calm as Sunday morning, "before you take over anything, let me ask you something. Do you know why they call you the Shark?" The question caught Torino off guard. He straightened up, confusion flickering across his face. "What kind of stupid question is that? Humor me." Torino shrugged, his confidence returning. "Because I smell blood in the water. Because I circle my prey before I strike. Because when I bite, I don't let go until there's nothing left." Bumpy nodded thoughtfully, like he was considering the wisdom of a philosophy professor. "That's interesting. You know what I learned about sharks during my time inside?" He stood up slowly, and for the first time that night, something in his movement made the room tense. Not because he looked threatening. He looked almost scholarly. But there was something in his deliberation that made smart men nervous. Sharks are perfect predators in water, apex killers. Nothing can touch them in their element. He paused, letting that sink in. "But you know what else I learned about sharks, Vincent? Take them out of water and they suffocate. They die slow, gasping for something they can't find." Torino's laugh was louder this time, but it had an edge to it. "What the hell are you talking about, old man? I'm talking about the fact that you've been swimming in my waters for months, thinking you're the apex predator. But this isn't the ocean, Vincent. This is Harlem. And in Harlem there are rules you don't understand." Bumpy walked to the window overlooking the street, his hands clasped behind his back like a general surveying a battlefield. "For instance, did you know that every corner you've taken, every collection you've muscled, every cop you think you've bought, they've all been reported back to me? Did you know that your own soldiers have been telling me about your moves for weeks?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Torino's eyes darted to his men, looking for signs of betrayal, but their faces revealed nothing. "You're bluffing," Torino said, but his voice had lost some of its swagger. Bumpy turned back to face him, and for the first time that night, his smile wasn't pleasant. It was the smile of a man holding 4 aces while his opponent was betting everything on a pair of 2s. The evidence when arrogance meets documentation I. Bumpy reached into his other jacket pocket and pulled out a manila envelope, thick with papers. "Tell me, Vincent, what did you do with the money from last Tuesday's collection on the 145th Street? Torino's face went pale. That collection had been off the books, private. Something only he and his most trusted lieutenant knew about. "And what about the little arrangement you made with Detective Morrison? The one where you promised him 20% of everything in exchange for looking the other way when your boys got rough with the numbers runners?" Now Torino was sweating despite the cool air. Morrison was dirty, but that deal was supposed to be buried deeper than Jimmy Hoffa. Bumpy continued, his voice never rising above conversational level. "Or my personal favorite, the letter you wrote to Don Castigliano asking for permission to eliminate me, the one where you called me, and I quote, an aging relic who's forgotten that evolution always wins." The blood drained from Torino's face completely. That letter had been hand-delivered by his most trusted courier to Castigliano's private residence. The fact that Bumpy knew about it meant either Castigliano had betrayed him or, "See, Vincent, that's the difference between a shark and a chess master. Sharks attack what they see. Chess masters control what their opponents don't see." Bumpy walked back to his chair, but he didn't sit down. Instead, he placed both hands on the table and leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "For 3 months, you've been making moves, thinking you were hunting me. But every move you made, every decision you thought was brilliant, every moment you thought you were gaining ground, you were actually following a path I laid out for you." The room was so quiet you could hear hearts beating. "You see, I needed you to commit crimes I could document. I needed you to make enemies I could turn into allies. I needed you to expose your network so I could map it completely. And most importantly, I needed you to disrespect me publicly, in front of witnesses, so that when I destroyed you, no one could say it wasn't justified." The trap revealed perfect strategic destruction. Torino's hands were shaking now. "You're saying all of this was a setup?" Bumpy's smile was gentle, almost fatherly. "Vincent, from the moment you stepped foot in Harlem, you've been a dead man. The only question was whether you'd die as a cautionary tale or as a legend. You chose cautionary tale." The envelope landed on the table with a sound like a judge's gavel. "Inside this envelope is everything. Every crime you've committed in my territory. Every law you've broken. Every person you've hurt. Every dirty deal you've made. All documented. All verified. All ready to be delivered to the right people at exactly the right time." Torino looked around the room desperately, finally understanding that he wasn't just outnumbered. He was outplayed. "You can't. The families won't stand for this kind of trickery." "The families?" Bumpy's laugh was soft, almost musical. "Vincent, who do you think gave me permission to handle this situation however I saw fit? Did you really believe you could operate in Harlem without the old Italians knowing every move you made?" The truth hit Torino like a physical blow. Not only had Bumpy been 3 steps ahead of him the entire time, the very people he thought would protect him had given Bumpy the green light to destroy him. "You threw whiskey in my face tonight, thinking you were humiliating me, but what you actually did was give me the final piece I needed. Because now every man in this room witnessed you cross a line that can't be uncrossed. Now when your body turns up in the East River tomorrow morning, it won't be murder. It'll be justice." But as the words settled over the room like a death shroud, as Torino realized he'd been playing checkers against a chess grandmaster, Bumpy Johnson made a move that no one saw coming. He picked up the envelope and handed it directly to Vincent Torino. "The ultimate power move, mercy as the cruelest punishment. But I'm not going to kill you, Vincent. That would be too easy, too quick, too merciful." The confusion in Torino's eyes was almost pitiable. "You're going to take that envelope, and you're going to walk out of here tonight. And then you're going to spend every remaining day of your life knowing that I own you completely. That I could destroy you with a phone call. That your life exists only because I allow it to exist." Bumpy leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the room. "Because death is final, Vincent. But living with the knowledge that you were completely outmatched by the man you tried to destroy, that's a lesson that lasts forever." The envelope trembled in Torino's hands as the full magnitude of his situation crashed down on him. He'd been played so completely, so thoroughly, that even mercy felt like defeat. The woman behind the curtain, a revelation within a revelation. But as Torino stood there holding the evidence of his own destruction, as Bumpy Johnson's impossible victory settled over the room like morning fog, neither man knew that someone else had been watching that night. Someone with their own plans. Someone who'd been waiting for exactly this kind of moment to reveal themselves. 3 blocks away, in the shadows of a construction site, a figure stepped out from behind steel beams and made a phone call that would change everything. "It's done," the voice said into the darkness. "Johnson played it exactly like you said he would. Torino's finished, but he doesn't know it yet." The person on the other end listened without speaking for a full minute before responding. "And the envelope, complete records. Everything Torino's done for 3 months. Financial records, witness statements, even photographs of the beatings. Johnson wasn't bluffing about anything. Perfect. Now we move to phase 2. What neither Bumpy Johnson nor Vincent Torino realized was that their entire confrontation had been orchestrated by someone playing a game so sophisticated it made chess look like checkers. Someone who'd been watching both men for months, waiting for exactly this moment when one would destroy the other, leaving a power vacuum that could be filled by the right person with the right plan. That person was Maria Santos, and she was about to become the most dangerous woman in New York. The invisible player. How information became the ultimate weapon. Maria Santos wasn't supposed to exist in their world. Women in 1955 organized crime were decorations, distractions, or victims, never players. But Maria had spent 10 years building something unprecedented, a network of information, loyalty, and influence that operated completely below the radar of every major crime family in the city. She'd started as a cleaning lady in mob social clubs, invisible to the men who discussed million-dollar operations like she was furniture. But Maria had something none of them possessed, the patience to listen for a decade while they revealed every secret, every weakness, every fear that kept them awake at night. The morning after the Rouse confrontation, Maria set her plan in motion. Her first stop was a small cafe in Little Italy, where she sat across from Detective Raymond Morrison, the same dirty cop who'd been taking money from Torino. Morrison arrived nervous, sweating through his shirt despite the cool October air. "You said you had information about the Johnson situation." Maria slid a manila envelope across the table, thinner than the one Bumpy had given Torino, but infinitely more dangerous. "Inside that envelope," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "are photographs of you taking money from Vincent Torino, bank records showing deposits that don't match your police salary, and sworn statements from 3 witnesses who can place you at crime scenes you never reported." Morrison's hands shook as he opened the envelope. His face went white as he saw images of himself accepting cash, shaking hands with known criminals, turning away from violence he was supposed to investigate. "What do you want?" he whispered. "I want you to arrest Vincent Torino tomorrow night. Charge him with everything Bumpy Johnson documented, plus the crimes you've been covering up. Make it public. Make it spectacular. Make it look like the police finally decided to clean house. The federal solution when justice becomes a weapon within 24 hours. Vincent Torino discovered that his humiliation at Rouse was just the beginning. The real destruction came not from Bumpy's revenge, but from something far more devastating: the full weight of the American justice system, wielded by someone who understood exactly how to make it dance to her tune. Thursday night, 9:47 p.m. Vincent Torino was walking out of Gino's Steakhouse, his usual Thursday dinner spot, when 6 federal agents surrounded him like wolves circling wounded prey. The flashbulbs started popping immediately. Reporters had been tipped off, positioned perfectly to capture every moment of his humiliation. "Vincent Torino, you're under arrest for racketeering, extortion, assault, and conspiracy to distribute narcotics," Special Agent Crawford announced, his voice carrying across the street loud enough for every witness to hear clearly. But here's what made it truly devastating: the newspapers painted him not as a master criminal brought down by a worthy opponent, but as a small-time thug who'd gotten too ambitious. Not a shark who'd met a bigger predator, but a minnow who'd forgotten his place in the food chain. The federal prosecutors offered him a deal: 20 years if he cooperated, life if he didn't. Every piece of evidence Bumpy had documented was now federal evidence. Every witness Bumpy had cultivated was now a federal witness. But the real punishment wasn't the prison time. It was the knowledge that he'd been played so completely, so thoroughly, that his humiliation had become legend on the streets. The new partnership: when enemies become assets. 3 days after Torino's arrest, Bumpy Johnson sat in his office above Small's Paradise, reading the morning paper with something approaching amazement. Torino's downfall had dominated headlines for 72 hours straight, and somehow Bumpy's name had never appeared in a single article. That's when his secretary knocked on the door. "Mr. Johnson, there's a lady here to see you," says her name is Maria Santos. Bumpy had been expecting this visit since Wednesday afternoon, but that didn't make him any less curious about what this mysterious woman actually wanted. Maria entered his office like she belonged there. Not arrogant, not nervous. Just comfortable in a way that suggested she'd been in plenty of powerful men's offices before. She was carrying a leather briefcase and wearing a smile that managed to be both respectful and confident. "Mr. Johnson, thank you for seeing me. Miss Santos, I have to admit, your timing has been remarkable." She sat down without being invited, crossing her legs and placing the briefcase on her lap. "I told you Vincent Torino would be arrested. I told you it would look like justice instead of revenge. I told you the envelope would become federal evidence. You did. What I'm wondering is how a woman I'd never heard of until 3 days ago managed to orchestrate a federal investigation." Maria's laugh was soft, musical. "Mr. Johnson, I didn't orchestrate anything. I simply provided the right information to the right people at the right time. Federal agents have been watching Torino for months. They just needed someone to gift-wrap their case for them." She opened the briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "But that's not why I'm here today. I'm here because Vincent Torino was never your real problem. The bigger game. When individual victory becomes system change, what Maria revealed that afternoon changed everything Bumpy thought he knew about the game he'd been playing. Torino wasn't just a rogue operator trying to muscle in on Harlem. He was part of something larger, more systematic, more dangerous than any individual mobster could ever be. Operation Cleanup. Maria explained, showing Bumpy classified documents that should have been impossible for her to obtain. "It's a joint task force between the FBI and NYPD and the district attorney's office. Their goal is to eliminate organized crime in New York entirely within 5 years. The folder contained organizational charts showing every major crime family in New York. Bumpy's own organization was prominently featured, with detailed information about his operations, his associates, his financial networks. But what made his hands clench into fists was the notation at the top of his section, Priority Target Alpha. They're not coming for you with bullets, Johnson. They're coming for you with laws, with taxes, with federal charges that will turn your own people against you. They're going to do to every major operator in New York exactly what they just did to Torino." But here's what Maria offered that no one else could: the ability to stay 3 steps ahead of every law enforcement agency in New York. Not through violence, not through corruption, but through information so complete and current that every move against him would be anticipated, countered, and turned into an advantage. The evolution of power, from crime boss to system master. Over the following months, Bumpy Johnson's organization transformed into something unprecedented in the history of organized crime. Instead of fighting the system, they learned to control it. Instead of corrupting officials, they provided them with information that made their careers. Every corrupt cop who got caught now worked for them. Every dirty politician who got exposed now owed them favors. Every federal agent who got fed reliable information now considered them valuable sources rather than targets. Maria's network had grown from information gathering to information warfare, and Bumpy's reputation had evolved from feared crime boss to something even more powerful, an untouchable problem solver who could make anything happen without leaving fingerprints. The beauty of their system wasn't just its effectiveness, it was its invisibility. To outside observers, it looked like law enforcement was finally getting serious about cleaning up New York. Arrests were being made. Corruption was being exposed. Justice was being served. What they couldn't see was that every move, every investigation, every headline was being orchestrated by 2 people who'd learned to play the system better than the people who'd created it. The lesson that echoed through time. 6 months after that night at Rouse, Bumpy received a letter from an unexpected source, Vincent Torino himself. Written from his federal cell, it contained just 7 words. "I finally understand what you taught me." Because that's what separated legends from cautionary tales. Legends taught lessons that echoed through generations. They showed other men what was possible when intelligence replaced impulse, when strategy replaced emotion, when patience became the deadliest weapon of all. The lesson Torino learned too late was the same one Bumpy had mastered in Alcatraz. In the real game of power, the most dangerous move is the one your opponent never sees coming. The most devastating victory is the one that looks like justice. The most effective weapon is the one that makes your enemies destroy themselves. Today, when young operators in New York talk about respect, they don't just talk about Bumpy Johnson's reputation or Maria Santos's network. They talk about that night when a man threw whiskey in the wrong face and learned that some battles are lost the moment you think you're winning them. They call it the whiskey lesson, the night that proved the difference between being feared and being respected, between having power and understanding power, between playing the game and mastering it. The ultimate victory, when destruction becomes creation, because in the end, Vincent Torino didn't just lose a war with Bumpy Johnson. He lost a war with himself. His arrogance, his impatience, his need to prove his dominance through humiliation, all of it became the weapons that destroyed him. Bumpy Johnson, meanwhile, had proven something that would echo through the underworld for decades. The most powerful response to disrespect isn't rage, it's patience. The most effective revenge isn't violence. It's victory so complete your enemy has to live with the knowledge of how thoroughly they were outmatched. The whiskey that dripped down Bumpy's face that night didn't wash away his dignity. It baptized him into a new level of power that few men in history have ever achieved, the kind of power where your enemies defeat themselves. The kind of respect that comes not from what you can destroy but from what you can create. The kind of legend that proves the deadliest weapon in any war isn't the gun in your hand. It's the mind behind the strategy. That's the lesson Vincent Torino learned in a federal prison cell 20 years too late. And that's why even today, when someone in New York thinks they're tough enough to disrespect a legend, older and wiser voices remind them of the man who threw whiskey in Bumpy Johnson's face and discovered that the most devastating response to violence isn't more violence. It's the calm, calculated patience of a master who knows that real power doesn't need to prove itself through force. It proves itself through results. And the results spoke for themselves. One man destroyed without a single punch being thrown, through nothing more dangerous than the patient application of intelligence, strategy, and perfect timing. That's the kind of victory that changes not just individual lives, but entire systems. That's the kind of lesson that echoes through generations. And that's how a moment of disrespect became the catalyst for the most sophisticated display of power in the history of organized crime. Some lessons are written in whiskey and remembered forever. And this one taught every criminal in New York that the most dangerous opponent isn't the one who fights the hardest. It's the one who thinks the clearest, waits the longest, and strikes with the precision of a master craftsman who spent years perfecting his art. Vincent Torino thought he was humiliating Bumpy Johnson. Instead, he gave him the perfect opportunity to demonstrate why legends aren't born. They're forged in moments like these, when everything depends on keeping your head while everyone else is losing theirs. And that's exactly what Bumpy Johnson did. The legacy when individual success becomes social change. By 1960, the model that Bumpy and Maria had created was being studied not just by criminals and law enforcement, but by sociologists and political scientists who recognized something unprecedented in the relationship between established power and emerging influence. The implications extended far beyond organized crime. Civil rights leaders began studying Bumpy's methods for insights into how to create change within legal frameworks rather than outside them. Even international diplomats found lessons in his approach to negotiating from positions of apparent weakness. But perhaps the most important legacy was the proof that intelligence, patience, and strategic thinking could triumph over brute force and blind ambition. Vincent Torino had represented everything that was wrong with the old way of doing things. The assumption that might made right, that fear was more powerful than respect, that immediate gratification was more valuable than long-term strategy. Bumpy Johnson had proven that all of those assumptions were not just wrong, they were self-defeating. That in a world where information moved faster than bullets, where reputation mattered more than intimidation, the smart money was always on intelligence over violence. 20 years after that whiskey hit his face, Bumpy Johnson died peacefully, having transformed from criminal to problem solver. His funeral drew thousands, including representatives from law enforcement agencies and political organizations that had learned to see him as a legitimate force for positive change. Vincent Torino died 3 years earlier in federal prison, still serving the sentence that had begun the night he threw whiskey in Bumpy's face. His death merited 3 lines in the back pages, not because no one remembered him, but because everyone remembered him as a cautionary tale. The difference between the two men wasn't intelligence or opportunity or even luck. It was philosophy. One had believed that power came from taking what you wanted. The other had understood that real power came from creating what everyone needed. In the end, Vincent Torino threw whiskey in Bumpy Johnson's face thinking he was demonstrating power. Instead, he demonstrated the difference between force and finesse, between intimidation and intelligence, between temporary aggression and lasting authority. The lesson echoes still: real power doesn't need to shout, it whispers. And when it speaks, everyone listens. Because that's what Vincent Torino learned too late. In a federal prison cell where he had 20 years to think about 5 seconds of arrogance that destroyed his life. And that's what every criminal in New York learned from his example. That the most dangerous opponent isn't the one with the biggest gun or the loudest voice. It's the one with the patience to wait, the intelligence to plan, and the wisdom to know that real victory isn't about destroying your enemies. It's about making them destroy themselves. The whiskey dried long ago. But the lesson remains: throw a drink in the wrong face, and you might just discover that the most devastating response to disrespect isn't rage. It's the calm, calculated certainty of a master who knows that time, patience, and intelligence will always triumph over impulse, arrogance, and brute force. Some lessons are written in whiskey, others are written in wisdom. The best ones are written in both and remembered forever. And in the decades since that night at Rouse, when young men in New York think they're tough enough to challenge someone they don't understand, when arrogance meets intelligence, when impulse confronts strategy, older voices always tell them the same story, about the mob boss who threw a drink in Bumpy Johnson's face and learned that the most devastating response to violence isn't more violence. It's the patient, calculated application of superior intelligence. That's the whiskey lesson. That's the power of thinking 3 moves ahead. And that's why legends aren't born from moments of rage. They're forged in moments of perfect, unshakable calm.